Take a few moments now to check your drawing to identify any problem areas we missed in the early stages. For instance, in the house on the left, I've shortened the veranda. I've also put a little flesh colour on the figures because they will be painted in one continuous wash, and I don't want their hair or shirt colours to flood into their faces. Now for the trees. I'm starting with the trees in the background and using a light bluish green made from raw umber and cobalt blue to push them back. I drag a dry brush in crescent shapes first, and that helps indicate the less dense tops where the light shows through. And then I drop in a darker mix under the crescents, indicating the more dense foliage as well as the shady underparts. Now I'm using an even darker mix here to contrast with the white church and the white cross at the apex and the chimney to make them stand out. There is a brighter green tree growing closer to the house, and I'm going to be leaving a dry white area for that to fit into, while also considering the size and shape of these trees further in the background. The closer green tree needs to be a little bit warmer to bring it forward, so I'm using a mix of cadmium yellow and cobalt blue. Whenever you use cadmium yellow, use it in a very weak way because it can tend to take over and look quite nasty and pasty. I've left bits of white here in the top leaves, and I'm filling in the more dense areas around the roof and the chimney. And while that's still wet, I'll drop in some darker spots around the chimney to make that stand out. Now for the large tree on the left of the house, once again dragging a dry brush up, across and down to create crescent shapes. Do try to vary the size, length and placement of these shapes so that your tree doesn't end up looking like a series of balls in the air. And now's a good time to soften that perimeter with clean water in keeping with what we did on the right side of the picture. Well, that water isn't exactly clean, is it? But it's okay because I really want a lot of undefined, mysterious spaces under and around this tree, so that'll be fine. Back to our tree. Here I'm dropping in a darker undersides, not necessarily all the same colour or tone, and it's important to have variation. Leave lots of white under your branches. When you come to the house though, butt the paint up right to the roof and try not to leave a lot of white speckles around that area. It just helps the eye see the roof. And when you're happy with the look of your leafy clumps, pick up a brush full of mid to dark brown, and with the brush held near the end and with a light touch, drag it up and through the wet bits and the dry, airy areas, creating an elegant pattern of trunks and branches. It might seem random, but a lot of thought has to go into what colours, shape and tones to paint this entire corridor of trees before we begin painting them. In the process, my main considerations were A, how to keep the passage interesting, and the answer is variation. Variation in heights of trees, shapes of trees, colours of trees. And B, how to let it complement the entire scene, but keep it from standing out too much because it is in the background. It's not part of the focal point. And the answer for that is tonal values. Keep them light enough not to jump out at you. Now I've been creating some of that undefined mysterious background and concentrating some bluey grey colours either side of that left-hand veranda post, between the gaps that the trunks have made, putting a bit of colour around this fence post and between the little fence posts where you can see the garden behind them. Now for that big tree behind the main house. What big tree, you might ask? Well, you're right, there is no tree in the photo, but it's my painting and I think there should be. Once again, it's a series of dry brush strokes in crescent shapes for the tops of the bunches of leaves, followed by one or more applications of wet, darker paint to depict the denser parts. Now, if you end up with one of your crescents looking more like a mushroom, just drag a dry brush in parts to give it a different shape. And as we've done elsewhere, soften the side with water. Now with this foreground tree, we need to be quite bold with contrast and tone. And I'm going to bring in a rather dark bluey green. Doesn't look bluey green, it looks more like charcoal grey, but trust me, it is a green. And I'm bringing that in to show the shaded undersides of these bunches of the leafy bunches of the tree. Once you're happy with the shape of that tree, I'm going to bring in a little bit of warm orangey colour. It's a quinacridone gold, I think, mixed with raw sienna. And I'm going to put just a few little dry brush strokes of this on the outer or upper branches, just to sort of warm that up a bit and bring that whole tree forward. Now for the branches. Start with thin, elegant strokes and then thicken the lower branches with darker paint. Hold the brush near the top and using the whole forearm rather than just the wrist. Hopefully you'll get some nice elegant marks there. Now all this is done while the wash is still quite wet and alive. But you must use a thicker consistency so that the brown doesn't run uncontrollably into the greens, especially now when you come in to paint a darker, thicker mix in those middle branches, the thicker ones. It just diffuses nicely but doesn't run uncontrollably through your greens. Now, while I've still got the original wash of raw umber and cobalt blue mixed up, I'm going to drop in a loose wash and get some colour on the road. First, some long strokes of water following the line of the road, and then my soft cool grey colour and a small amount of brown madder to warm up the foreground and pull that forward. It doesn't have to be defined, just as long as you follow that general slope of the road. And we're not going to paint right down to the bottom edge of the picture. As we know, we're trying to create an undefined perimeter. So what washes down there will, but we're not going to make a point of it. So here's a recap of our painting so far. And while you weren't looking, voila, by the magic of video, I've completed some detailing on the small house, but please don't feel left out of the process because you'll see how I did this when I finish off the main house later. I've also painted the shadow made by the lacework on the church, and I'll continue with the other one now. I begin by placing a little water where the shadow ends against the wall. The shadow colour I like to use is brown madder mixed with cobalt blue to give a soft grey blue at the consistency of 2 or 3. And then with a fine brush I start dropping in my colour, first in the recesses, the little cutaways, and then where I've put the water. It's the light and shadow that really make watercolour paintings come alive. I just love painting a sunny day scene like this, and you can really make things pop out. Now, the shadow looks a bit dark to me, so you can just very gently mop a little of it up with a tissue, but do it in one light press and try not to dab. Now, I've stuck some masking tape here to help me get the angle of this shadow right. See how it's cast at the same angle of the shadow on the main house? Shadows in life can be quite complex. For example, cast shadows are often softer at the outer edge. And this haloed effect actually has a name. It's called the penumbra. And they're darkest where the shadow meets the object that's casting the shadow. So I'll begin again with some clean water to the outer edge where the penumbra would be, and then bring in my shadow colour, cutting around the roof and guttering. Let me show you the photo again so you've got a better idea of where I'm going with this. So you bring the colour down, and when you reach the part where the shadow meets the wall, drop in a little bit darker paint for a subtle but more convincing effect. Now you cut around the bush to the right and also the one at the bottom, but just use water here and bring it up to meet the paint. And the reason for this is, did you guess? Yes, it's the reflected light. Little bit more deep colour while that's still all wet. And there's a fence post here that needs a shady side, and so does the gate post. You might see a hint of the wall through some pickets, but don't overdo this. Now let's remove our tape. Lovely. And we'll put a shady side on the downpipe and the guttering of the main building of the church. Just while I'm doing this, let me give you a tip about the dry brush technique. What you do is you hold the brush parallel to the paper with your fingers along the top of the brush. The idea is to touch the belly of the brush to the paper and not the point. Now in part 3, I'll be painting the figures and the bushes along the fences. But I've completed the bushes behind the figures in advance so they'll have time to dry first. So join me then when hopefully this picture will be almost completed.